that of
then you can speak. Help me see if there are interesting Bom dia, é com prazer que recebemos hoje a professora ANIKA NICOLESI, da Universidade de Parma, para falar sobre Archíloco e a poesia grega arcaica de Homero a Baccylides. A professora ANIKA ela tem uma publicação e estudos extensivos sobre a poesia grega arcaica, particularmente Hipônax e Archíloco, sobre o qual ela já publicou um livro sobre as elegias do Archíloco, né? Ela tem também a obra completa dele, Testemunhos e Fragmentos Traduzidos, e ela tem um livro também sobre Édilo de Samos, os epigramas. Vou aproveitar e fazer uma propaganda de dois membros da casa, né, do Rafael Brunhara, que infelizmente não estará conosco. Ele participa agora de um evento ao mesmo tempo na Alemanha, em Bochum, então ele não vai poder participar, mas ele e a Giuliana têm também um livro recente sobre elegia grega arcaica. Então, depois da palestra da professora ANIKA, Tadeu, Andrade, que é da Universidade Federal da Bahia, e a Giuliana Ragusa, minha colega aqui da USP, e nós desenvolveremos uma conversa com a ANIKA, e também vocês escrevam as suas perguntas no chat, que o Tadeu vai tentar recuperar as perguntas para que a professora ANIKA possa respondê-las depois da sua palestra. Tá? Então, dou a palavra à professora ANIKA, que está participando agora do nosso grupo de pesquisa do CNPq, Estudos sobre jambo, elegia, mélica e música na Antiguidade Clássica. Welcome, ANIKA.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Professor Paula Corrêa, for a kind invitation. I'm very happy to speak today with colleagues and students about Archilocus. I share my slides. Good. As we know, Homer is a very important model for Archilocus and for all Greek archaic poetry. It is not possible to state if this link was a conscious recall or only a simple illusion of common motifs and themes with different objectives for different audience. I think it is reliable that there was a common cultural heritage that, starting from Homer, was sharing through the authors and through the genres. I start to this idea to speak about an intertextual link between Homer, Archilocus, and Baccylides. As we will see, the three poets share a similar theme and motives. First, I want to point out that we will not follow a chronological order. The first author we deal with will be Homer, then Baccylides, and only the last one will be Archilocus. We will go on from what is new, the link between Homer, Book 15, and Baccylides, to better explain what is new, Archilocus and his link with the same theme. I think that Archilocus in the so-called Telephus elegy reuses the same images of Homer exactly as Baccylides does after him, with the same sympathetic attitude, and I try to show you. Homer. There was an episode of the 15th book of the Iliad that was very famous in ancient time. It is the so-called the flight to the ships. It is a long narrative from verse 346 to verse 746, the end of the book. There is only a little excursus where Homer describes Patroclus and the wounded Euripylus. They are away from the battle. We read together some passages that I think can highlight my point of view. First point. In the episode of the flight to the ships, Achaeans, although they are the heroes that will win at Troy, lost their strength. They fly quickly to their ships and they are hunted by the Trojans that are the winners of the battle. Verse 346 and following. I give you text and English translation by Murray. Hector de Troesi Kekleto Macron Ausas Neusi Episeuesai, and Hector shouted aloud and called the Trojans, speed yet against the ships. The episode is a long narrative of war. Achaeans and Trojans who fight hand to hand, autoskedon, as Homer wrote. We read about a lot of duels. Second point, Hector for Trojans and Ajax for the Greek warriors are the two heroes of the opposite sides. They struggle with each other, but no one can overcome the enemy. And this is due to their value, but also for the will of gods. We can see verse 415 and following. But Hector made straight for glorious Aias, nor might the one drive back the other and burn the ship with fire, nor the other thrust him back, now that a god had brought him night. Another point. Both heroes call to the battle their comrades and encourage them to die while fighting for their country. These are the words of Hector, verses 494 and following. Oi aikes anumeno peri patres tesnomen. No unseemly thing is it for him to die while fighting for his country. About Ajax, we can mention verses 501 and following, where he says that they must either perish utterly or find deliverance. E apolesai e sothenesai in Greek. Ajax also exhorts his comrades and remembers them that from them that flee springs neither glory or any value. Verse 561 and following. Theugonton, in Greek, dute arakleos ornitai uteti alke. Then, close to the words of Ajax are those of Nestor, who encourages comrades to turn not back in flight. Verses 661 following. Mete tropasse phobonde. Another point, because of the value in war of both ranks, we have a stalemate. Verse 505 and following. Achaeans cannot to thrust enemies back from the ships, and the Trojan can break the Danaans. No one can reach his objectives. Ude dynanto, in Greek, aposasai paraneon, ude pote troes danaon, e dynanto phalangas examenoi. Fifth point. Many times Homer underlines the values of Greek warriors. For example, verse 561. Oide kai autoi alexastai meneinon. And they even of themselves were eager to ward off the foe. We can also see verse 622. Os danaoi troas menon empeton ude febonto. Danas withstood and fled not, the Trojans. In spite of this, Trojans overcome, and Greek warriors must come back to the ships and reach the shore of the sea. verses 696 and following. Akaioi uk efansan teuxasai upek kaku aloesai. Achaeans verily deemed that they should never escape from out the peril, but should perish. A very important point is that Greeks are overcome by the Trojans because of the will of gods. Apollo has the leadership of the Trojans. Homer explained this at verse 360 and the following. Pro d'Apollon, and before them went Apollo. This is retold also at verses 361 and following. Su foibe autoisi de Physan en Orsas, Phoebus on themselves en route. Even Zeus sided with the Trojans. Hector himself underlined this, verse 719. Nune min panton Zeus axion emar edocen. Now hath Zeus give us a day that is a recompense for all. The Father of Gods know that the Trojans will be routed, but he encouraged them. Verse 567. Epide Zeus Troas egeren, and against them Zeus urged on the Trojans. Zeus takes care of the Trojans' warriors. He takes part in the battle to prevent Hector from being wounded by Teucer's arrows. And Hector himself recognized the omen and recalls it to his comrades. Verses 588 and following. Reia darignotos dios Andrade ginetai alke. Full easy to discern is the aid Zeus gives to men. This is the plan of Zeus, the father of God and human being, plans to support Hector so that he can set fire to one of the ships. Then he will allow Greeks to win. We read it in verses 592 and following. Troes neusi epeseuto. And then Hectorigar oi tumos buleto cudos orexai. And finally, Ecgarde tu emele palioxin paraneon cesemenai tron danaoisi de cudos orexai. Trojans rush upon their ships, for his heart was set on giving glory to Hector. For from that time forth was he to ordain giving back of the Trojan from the ships and to grant glory to the Danas. As a last point, we focus on the language. It is a very important point because we find the usual lexicon of war employed by Homer. We can find words that describe all the nuances of the war's experience. Words that describe war's value and know-how. For example, verse 527, eu eidota tsuridos arches. Verse 584, osra oi antios else ceonana deioteta, it is Hector. We have words for describe courage in war experience. Otrune menos, kaitsumon, menontes menon, something like this. We have words that recall fear and desire to fly. For example, verse 366, Physan and Orsas, Apollo against Achaeans. Finally, we have words that describe the sadness for the defeat. verse 629. For example, os edaizeto tumos enis in Achaion. So were the herds of the Achaeans. Then we find the description of heroes that scream loudly on the battlefield. For example, verse 585, Ekekleto Macron ausas, a call with a loud shout at Hector. Or verse 732, Aieides Merdon, Bon, Danoisi, Kelewe, and they were with terrible cries he called to the Danans, it is Ajax. Finally, we have the image of the battlefield that becomes red for the blood of the dead. For example, verse 715, Re daimati Gaia Melaina, and the black herd flowed with blood. So, the word description, the will of gods, and the unexpected new deal of the battle were probably the reasons of the fame of this episode since antiquity. Baccylides showed to know very well the Homeric episode in his 13 Epinicius. The text of about 487 or 481 before Christ was written to praise the victory at the Nemean Games in the Pancratium of a player from Aegina. The same victory was praised by Pindar II in the 5th Nemean. Main part of the text concerned the island of Aegina, homeland of the winner and homeland of the famous lineage of Aeacus. He was the hero, son of the eponymous nymph Aegina and father of Telamon and Peleus, from which Ajax and Achilles descended. The tale is inspired by the Homer Iliad and the episode of the flight to the ships. There are many similarities with the Homeric text, and the scholar highlighted them. I want to focus on the paradox through which Baccylides employed Homeric framework and text to praise the value of Greek heroes that in the episode of the Iliad we have seen before are the victim of the Trojans. It twists the Homeric text and turns its meaning. Baccylides show the myth with a sympathetic point of view, something that we can find in the Homeric text. We have a lyrical text in which the author stresses the value of Ajax and his comrades, although they are overcome by the Trojans. Let's see the text. I give you the critical text by Irigoyen, text edited for the Belles Lettres, who suggests a beginning gap of 10 verses. Otherwise, Meller, text edited for Teubner, suggests that there are lost 43 verses at the beginning. These are the numbers in brackets. The first point of interest is the description of Ajax, who reject Hector's assaults, verses 72 and following. He stood at his ship's stern and stopped Hector. Ostepi rumnai staseis. A duel between Ajax and Hector never been in Homer, where Achilles in the last book fights directly only against Hector. The second focus is the mention of the value of Achilles and the fear raised among the Trojans, verses 81 and following. They are paralyzed in their terror of battle and are frightened by Achilles. This is what we can see in text, in Greek text. Achilles is not mentioned in the Iliadic episode of the 15th book. He cannot suffer the shame of fleeing to the ships because he will be the winner of Troy and he will kill Hector. Then we have the tale of Achilles withdraw from the war due to the kidnapping of Briseis. The poet described the happiness of the Trojans. He mentioned the previous fear felt by them, who are now compared to those who see the light of the sun after the storm. These are verses 88 and following. The men take hurt in just way when the Trojans heard that Achilles, and etc. We find a similar comparison in the 15th book of the Iliad, referred to the Greeks. In the Homeric text, Greek heroes hunted by the Trojans are compared to sailors frightened in the storm, verses 624 and following. And fell upon them, even as when a fierce rushing wave falleth upon us swift ships. Even so were the heirs of the Achaeans. In Homer, the motives of the storm is an image of fear, not of happiness, like in Baccylides. I think it is the key to the reverse reading of the two texts. In Homer, Trojans win for their value, in Baccylides they win for the will of gods, but the real value is that of the Greek heroes. The ambiguous story described by Baccylides brings the narrative back to the present, to Hector who wins on the battlefield and blushes it with the blood of the enemies. Verses 116 and following. Aimati Gaia Melaina Hectorea Supokeiros. And the Trojans come to the shore, and the dark single ran red with the blood of men Hector had killed. Here, Greek heroes, as in Homer text, are again victims of the Trojans. But the real feeling of Baccylides is revealed by the employ of the same image describing the value of Greek warriors. This time the image is referred to the shore and the water of the river Scamander. Verse 131 and following. Oinigzein Scamandron. Achilles, this time. It is a topic image since Homer, as we have seen before. In the episode of the Iliad, the battlefield became red for the blood of the heroes. So, the same image is used twice by Baccylides for two different ranks and for two different heroes, Greeks and Trojans. I think that it is another key of the ambiguous attitude of Baccylides about this episode. With the praise of the Genos of Aeacus, the mythological narrative ends. Then we have a sentence, gnome, verses 162 and following, in which the poet contrasts epainos, praise, and truth, to envy and blame. Emetina cersiepes sonos beatei, aineto sophon andra sun dica. Let anyone who envy has not struck down praise this man, as is right and proper. The unexpected sentence is the framework, the recomposition, by which the poet recalls the beginning of the poem, verses 11 and following, where he says that the good man, perhaps Heracles, will prevail over arrogance and violence. Ubrios upsinou pausei dicas sanatoisi crainon. The myth therefore clarified the sympathetic view of Baccylides toward the Greek heroes, who have unjustly suffered the shame of fleeing to the ships. So myth reveals the poet's will to re-establish the truth, or at least the right epilogue of the Trojan story. We want to rectify the abuses suffered by the Achaeans for the will of gods, and want to confirm the value and virtue of the Greek heroes, the descendants of Aeacus. And then we go to Archilochus. And now we come to Archilochus. How Homer and Baccylides are related to Archilochus. Let's see together my point of view. The so-called Telephus elegy will be our focus. It is a long text from papyrus of about 2nd century. I show you the text of my edition on Archilochus elegies with some more supplements. Then I give you also the translation of Dirk Obink. Text tells of an episode that belongs to the Homeric cycle, but what happens comes before the story told by Homer. Text describes a fighting at the banks of the Caicos River, and it is due to a course error. On one hand, we find the Greek heroes led by Agamemnon. Achaeans are thinking to be at Troy, but they are wrong. On the opposite side, we have the inhabitants of the region of Mysia, led by Telephus, and Telephus is a Greek man. He was born in Arcadia, a man that due to his due to his biographical events, live in this region of Asia and leads its armies. In Archilochus fragments, the link with the Homeric text is very clear, I think. Especially we find it in the formulaic expressions that are very similar to those of Homer. Probably it is due also to the metric form involved elegiac couplets that are very close to the hexameter. For example, verse 10, Tina poluflois buiot talasse, verse 12, Eucnemides akaioi, verse 13, Esneas occuporus. Homeric poems involved is especially Iliad, its duels and its fighting. Exactly the episode we have seen before, the flight to the ships, is probably the first model of Archilochus, as it will be for Baccylides. It is stressed by the same lexicon that we have seen in Homer. For example, verse 6, Phobise polum straton, verse 7, Alchimoi, or 8, Aikmetai periontes, verse 11, Kersi upame lictu photos en airomenon, verse 12, Eucnemides akaioi, verse 18, Enza menos pneiontes, verse 22, Talacardion oion, verse 23, Deion en polemo, verse 24, Cacen tote fusa in orsas. There is also this can be our example. There is also an adverb of a great relevance, protropade, verse 12. This term is very rare and usually it is employed only in prose. It is attested only one time in Homer, with the same metric position of Archilochus at the beginning of the verse. It is the 16th book of the Iliad, verse 303 and following. It is a passage in which Homer describes the value of Trojan that after the assault to the Greek ships are now overcome by the Achaeans. But they still are valiant warriors, They were not driven in a headlong route by the Achaeans from the black ships, but they still sought to withstand them. Ugar poti Troes, Areiphilon, up Acaion, Protropadel Phobeonton, Melainaun Poneon, Alleti Ara, Ensistanto Neon, Dupoikon, Ananke, not yet driven in her long route, perforce they stood. Homer praises the value of the Trojan that are not flying away to the ships, as have done Greeks in the previous book. And this time too, events are due to the will of gods. Not only the lexicon, there are noteworthy similarities about the framework too. In Archilochus' text, Telephus has a very important role. We can read his name in two passages of the text, verse 5 and 24. In Archilochus, Telephus himself, for the will of gods, is the only reason of the defeat of the Greek heroes. For example, verse 5, Kai pote vel opote museon, as West suggests. I think there is a parallel between Telephus in Archilochus' text and Hector in the Homeric text. Another point is the god's epiphany on the battlefield. In Archilochus' elegy, the god involved is Heracles, father of Telephus, who is mentioned at verse 22, Heracles. He appears on the battlefield screaming loudly from afar, Ana tele boon, so Obing and West. In Homer, the father of God, Zeus, comes to help Hector. Archilochus' elegy is full of praise for Greek heroes. They are overcome by Telephus not only for the will of gods. Achaeans' value is recalled at verse 7, Alchimoi, and 8, Alchmetai. The will of God is stressed at verse 2, Zeucatere supanankes, 7, Etosa de moi ratione phobei, and maybe also at verse 25, Patrica Rhizomenos. These are the same views echoed from Homer in the episode of the flight to the ships. Another point we can see is this one. Another point is the inability to war and the desire to fly due to the will of God. That should also be emphasized. At verse 3, we read Cacotet Allegein. We can compare Homer Iliad book 15, verse 721, Cacotet Geronton. With this word, Hector remembers the previous lack of courage of the Trojans. At verse 4, we have Fugain feugonta, vel feugontas. The verb feugo often is used in the Iliad to describe what is not to do or what the Greek heroes are forced to do for the will of the gods. Then we can see verse 19, Aphrodie, Megalos, Zumona Kekedaton. We can compare Homer Iliad book 15, verse 629, Os edaizeto Zumon emis etzes in Acaion. It is the blood of Greek warriors sad for the defeat. Then we can see verse 24, Cacen tot fusa enorsas, and we can compare Homer Iliad book 15, verse 366. Autois de fusa enorsas, on themselves en route. So it is Apollo who flies the Achaeans. Another interesting point is at verse 6, Oi de Febonto. It is a supplement suggested by Obing. I like it. although it provides a groups of verbs with the same origin in the context, ephobese, phebonto, ephobei. The textual hypothesis finds support in the analogous position of the verb at the end of the line after a syntactic pause. We find this in Homer, Iliad Book 8, verses 342 and following. Oide phebonto, and they were driven en route. In this passage too is described the flight toward the ships of the Achaeans hunted by Hector. We can remember the 15 books, verse 345, Enza caenza phebonto. Finally, we can point out the image of the river Caicos and the plain of Mysia, this one, that become red for the blood of the Dides. Verses from 8 to 10. Ereites de Caicos pictonto Nicurum steineto Caipedion Museum. It is a distinctive section that characterizes this episode. It is mentioned in various authors, both Greek and Latin. We find it in the so-called Telephi Epilium, in a passage from Philostratus, and in Ovid Metamorphoses. But before, we find it in Pindar, that, as Baccylides refers the same image to the slaughter made by Telephus and to the one done by Achilles in the same episode, Isthmia 5 and 8. Then the same image, as we see before, is attested in Homer too, with reference to the episode of the flight to the ships. Last point might be also the wrong journey by the sea mentioned by Archilochus as a link with the Homeric episode 2. Archilochus' text involved are verses 16 and following. Oide tote blavcente odu parazzina ficonto, teutrantos deratren pros polin or numenoi vel ormeato. And verses 20 and following. Phantom garu psipolon tron polin eisanabainei. Gap, and then gan, the Patheon, Musida, Polophora. We can compare the Iliad verses 737 and following. In no wise is there hard attend a city fenced with walls, nigh it is in the plain of the Trojans. This is what Ajax says to strengthen the Achaeans' will. What we can say after this analysis? We can return to the text. Scholars have repeatedly highlighted and never solved the problem of the clear ambiguity that characterizes Archilochus' elegy on Telephus. Well, I think we can say that the ambiguity underlined by the Archilochus tale is the same already shown by the Homeric model, and later inherited by Baccylides. And we can add that Archilochus already assumes the subjective attitude that we have seen in Baccylides. It is difficult to say what Archilochus was referring to. We do not know what is the war episode involved, perhaps a local affair. And above all, it is hard to say where the poet of Paros and his comrades in arms should be placed, whether on the side of Telephus or, on the other hand, on the side of Greeks. We don't know the framework, and the beginning and the end of the poem are missing. The beginning of the poem is perhaps just near the gap, because the verses preserved show a generic idea that introduce the tale of the myth. More incomplete, I think, is the end, where, after the story of Telephus and the Greeks, we probably will have the return to the contemporary and to the life of the poet. Then, how can we summarize? I believe that Archilochus' ambivalence is the same that we find in Baccylides' tale. The similar way in which the poet alludes to Homer is highlighted by the analogous description of the slaughter, a key element of the episode which has a strong prominence. Archilochus' text, like Baccylides' later one, starting from the Homeric model, highlights continuously both the value of Greek heroes and the will of gods, the only reason that allows the supremacy of the enemy. The care that Homer shows for the Trojans, currently supported by Zeus but fated to defeat, is the same ambivalence of Baccylides, who used the description of the passive effort of the Greek heroes to finally prize their value. And it is, I think, the same ambivalence of Archilochus that sides or seems to side with Telephus, but that justified the Greek warriors too, and perhaps identified himself with them. In short, Archilochus already reuses Homer in a pathetic lyric key, exactly as in an even more clear way Baccylides will do later in his praise of the lineage of Aeacus. Thank you.
Thank you, ANIKA, for this interesting presentation. And I'd like to turn first to Tadeu and Giuliana if they have any comments. Tadeu?
Hi. Thank you for the presentation, ANIKA. I would like to ask you about the missing part of the poem, Archilochus' poem, the last part. In Homer, we have this situation where the Trojans have the upper hand at the beginning of book 15, but in the end there is a major reversal and they are forced to flee. In Archilochus, we don't know how the poem ends, but some think that maybe the second part of the myth, where Achilles wants Telephus, might be there as well. So there will be a further parallel between Homer and Archilochus, in that Archilochus would maybe represent a reversal, and maybe if you concern the present situation of the poem, maybe it could be related with a hope of a future victory. I would like to know, what do you think about this possibility?
Yes, I think it's a good point, a very good point. I agree with you. I think that for Archilochus and his comrades in arms, probably the future is the same of the Achaeans. And so, if they win, probably, also in the text of Archilochus that we can read, they are overcome by Telephus, maybe. And so, if in the last part of the text, if in this part of the text there be we can read Telephus wounded by Achilles, it will be confirmed. in the fragment of the battle in arms against the inhabitants of the region of Mysia, I think that Archilochus, describing this anti-heroic attitude against the will of God that can be opposed, alludes to a future ransom for Archilochus and his comrade in arms. And I think it could be stresses if in the last part of the text Archilochus speak about Achilles and Telephus.
Okay, thank you, ANIKA.
Thank you.
Giuliana?
Thank you, ANIKA, for your presentation and for letting us look at these pieces all together, Iliad 15, and then Baccylides 13, and the Telephus elegy of Archilochus. You talked a little bit about what would be, a question we could make if Telephus are the Achaeans, which are what is the most praised, or what is the viewpoint of the persona? Is he favoring Telephus, a figure, or the Achaeans in this episode? Because to me, it's really a puzzling thing, because the flight of the Achaeans is really, really ambivalent in the treatment here, right? It's justified, but it's kaken, it's vile, so I really don't know what to make of it. I don't think we have to answer it, of course, but I would like to hear you a little more on this point.
Yes, it is not easy to say this. We can know with certain the position of Archilochus. Text is lost, so it is not easy to say. There is a late source of Philostratus that say us that Telephus lost the shield during this episode. And so it is possible to think of an Archilochus fragment, a very famous Archilochus fragment, a fragment of the lost shield. It is possible also this point of view, we don't know. We can say maybe that Telephus does not die in this time, but he is wounded, and Achaeans are plied, but they win. So maybe I think that Archilochus has in mind both aspects of the story, maybe. And the abandonment of the shield imposed by the framework in exchange of life, and heroic virtue to be opposite to the will of gods, to avoid falling into an adverse situation. And so I think that maybe these 2 points are of relevance.
Okay, grazie.
Grazie.
Thank you, ANIKA, for presentation. I always find it very difficult, the question of intertextuality, when we have Archilochus and Homer that are not so distant in time, and also that pertain to the same tradition, the Ionic, same poetic tradition. But as always, it's the accumulation, the number of evidence and examples that will make our arguments more or less persuasive. And I think you have a very good point here. You have made a very good point in this presentation. One thing, going beyond this example, but thinking of this elegy that is our last, I hope not the last, but the most recent papyrus we have from Archilochus, and the novelty that it presented in being this longer narrative in elegiacs. How could we think of the relation of this narrative to the other war narratives in Archilochus that are not elegiacs, that are tetrameters?
Yes. And they are about war.
Yes. Could you comment a bit in terms of genre?
Yes.
How would you place those?
That's a good point, because the argument is the same, war, but the measure are different, elegiac and tetrameters. And so probably we can say that the authors, Archilochus, use the same argument for different meter in his text. I think so.
And I think that's interesting, because it prevents us from making these clear-cut separations in these modes of genre in Archilochus and the archaic poetry. I think also it reminded me that you consider what has been considered as spurious, the poem on Pasiphae, the 300, I think it's 331 or something like this, the number. That is an elegiac couplet, but it brings erotic content.
Yes. So is another argument that we normally think that is not omitted in, not present in elegiac poetry, in archaic poetry, and in elegiac of Archilochus. But I think that is the authorship is that of Archilochus. Archilochus is the author of this couplet. And so we can say that in his elegy, Archilochus say also something about Eros and this theme.
Yes. Although it's not vulgar as the iambics, the erotic language in this elegy, this couplet is not like that of the trimeters, but it's closer to the epodes, I would say.
Yes, it is very close to the epos words, and we have a lot of images in only a couple from the epos from Homer, and I think it is one of the reasons for ascribe this text to Archilochus. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Tadeu, do we have questions?
Let me see, Paula. I think no, we have no further questions. There are only people asking about the certificate, and we would like to know if there will be some certificate of participation.
We had not. This is a meeting of the research group, and it's not a formal event where we give out certificates, but eventually we might. Not this time. So if there are no more questions or no more comments, I would like once more to thank ANIKA's participation in these meetings. We hope to make them frequent, and so we hope to hear more of you in the future. And I thank also Tadeu and Giuliana for their participation.
Thank you all so much, and I hope to see you again.
Yes.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, Paula, for getting us together. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, ANIKA.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Posso chiudere?